Throw him out! I don't want that kid anywhere near my airplane. Richard Hawthorne's voice cracked across the private terminal with such force that conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every head turned toward Hangar 7 at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. The words echoed beneath the steel rafters as if the building itself had been ordered to obey. Standing 20 feet away, Marcus Bennett didn't flinch. At 19 years old, dressed in a Navy maintenance uniform with an intern badge clipped to his chest, he looked far younger than anyone expected to challenge a billionaire. His dark hands still held the inspection tablet showing engine diagnostics, while the morning sun reflected off the polished silver fuselage of the brand-new Gulfstream G700 parked behind him. 8 minutes later, smoke would rise above the runway, emergency sirens would drown out every other sound, and the same employees who silently watched him being escorted away would desperately wish someone had listened. But at that moment, nobody believed the quiet young black engineer standing alone against the most powerful man on the property. Earlier that morning had begun like every other internship shift. Marcus arrived before sunrise, carrying a worn backpack stuffed with engineering notebooks instead of expensive gadgets. While other interns hurried through their assigned inspections, he followed every checklist with unusual patience, the habit his late father had drilled into him years before while repairing Air Force transport aircraft outside Fayetteville. Machines don't care about confidence, his father used to say. They only care whether you respected the truth. Those words stayed with Marcus every time he touched an engine. He wasn't the loudest technician inside Hawthorne Aviation Services. He wasn't even officially certified yet, but everyone quietly admitted he noticed details most experienced mechanics overlooked. As he completed the final turbine inspection before the billionaire's scheduled departure to Manhattan, something caught his eye. A faint vibration pattern appeared on the diagnostic graph. Almost invisible, easy to dismiss as sensor noise. Marcus leaned closer. Then he spotted it. A hairline fracture along the compressor assembly, no wider than a credit card edge, and almost impossible to notice beneath the metallic finish. His heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Calm meant thinking clearly. He scanned the area again, compared thermal readings, then checked the maintenance history stored inside the aircraft database. Nothing. No previous report. No replacement record. He whispered to himself, "That shouldn't be there." Another technician walked past carrying a toolbox. "Everything good?" the older mechanic asked without stopping. Marcus hesitated before answering. "I think this engine needs another inspection." The mechanic glanced toward the executive terminal where luxury SUVs had already begun arriving. "Not today," he replied. "Mr. Hawthorne takes off in less than 30 minutes. Marcus looked back at the screen. "If I'm reading this correctly, it could become unstable under full takeoff thrust." The mechanic sighed. "Then tell your supervisor, fast." Marcus did exactly that. 5 minutes later, he found himself standing before Richard Hawthorne and half the executive staff instead of inside the maintenance bay where he belonged. The billionaire barely looked at the tablet Marcus held out. "Sir," Marcus said respectfully, "I believe the left engine may have a structural defect. I strongly recommend delaying departure until we perform another inspection." Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and gave a short laugh that carried no warmth. "You're the intern?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And you expect me to delay a $2 billion acquisition because of a guess?" Marcus met his eyes without raising his voice. "It's not a guess. The fracture could expand under maximum power. If that happens, the engine may fail." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. One senior engineer shifted his weight as though considering whether to speak. Nobody did. Richard stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Do you have any idea how much this delay would cost?" Marcus answered quietly. "Less than an accident would." Silence settled across the hangar. Even the baggage loaders paused beside the aircraft. Richard's expression hardened. "I've spent 40 years building companies," he said. "I'm not taking aviation advice from a 19-year-old intern." Marcus swallowed but refused to look away. "Sir, please. Just one additional inspection, that's all I'm asking." Richard turned toward security and pointed without another glance at Marcus. "Throw him out. Effective immediately. His internship is over." Marcus did not resist as the two security officers approached him. One reached politely toward the identification badge clipped to his uniform while the other gestured toward the terminal exit. Around them, dozens of employees suddenly became fascinated by their phones, toolboxes, or the polished concrete floor beneath their boots. Nobody wanted to become the next person standing in Richard Hawthorne's line of fire. Marcus unclipped the badge himself and handed it over without argument. "I am sorry if I caused trouble," he said quietly. One of the security officers looked almost embarrassed. "You did what you thought was right, kid." Marcus forced a small smile. "That does not always matter." Behind him, the boarding process continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Catering trucks rolled away from the aircraft. Fuel hoses were disconnected. The cabin door remained open while flight attendants welcomed passengers with practiced smiles that hid the pressure of an exact departure schedule. Marcus glanced toward the left engine one final time. The polished intake reflected the bright North Carolina sky so perfectly that the tiny flaw he had discovered seemed impossible to believe. He questioned himself for only a second before replaying every measurement in his mind. The vibration frequency, the abnormal heat signature, the microscopic crack hidden inside the compressor stage. Every detail aligned with the same conclusion. He had not imagined it. His phone vibrated inside his pocket. It was a message from his mentor, senior engineer Daniel Brooks, who had spent nearly 30 years maintaining corporate aircraft. "What happened?" "I heard Richard fired somebody." Marcus answered honestly. "It was me. I warned him about the engine." 3 dots appeared almost immediately before disappearing. A full minute passed before another message arrived. "Stay where you are. I am coming." Marcus waited outside the maintenance building near the chain-link fence overlooking the private runway. A humid breeze carried the smell of jet fuel mixed with freshly cut grass from the edge of the airfield. Above him, white clouds drifted slowly across the Carolina sky, calm enough to make the morning feel ordinary. Daniel Brooks arrived carrying his faded toolbox, his gray hair sticking out beneath an old baseball cap. He looked at Marcus for several seconds before speaking. "Tell me exactly what you found." Marcus opened the inspection file saved on his tablet. He enlarged the diagnostic graph and pointed toward the irregular vibration pattern. "The crack is here. It is small now, but under takeoff power, the stress could spread through the compressor blades." Daniel studied every image carefully. His expression changed from curiosity to concern. "Did anyone else verify this?" Marcus shook his head. Nobody wanted to delay the flight. Daniel looked toward the gleaming Gulfstream sitting beyond the terminal windows. "Richard hates delays more than bad news," Marcus answered softly. "Physics does not care about schedules." The older engineer almost smiled despite the tension surrounding them. "Your father used to say something very similar." Marcus looked down. "He taught me that if you see danger and stay quiet, then you become part of the mistake." Daniel folded his arms and exhaled slowly. "You remind me too much of him." They stood together in silence as ground crews completed the final walk-around inspection. Through the fence, they watched the cabin door close with a solid mechanical click. A tug vehicle gently pushed the aircraft away from the terminal before disconnecting. The engines remained quiet for a few moments. Then the first turbine began turning. A low hum rolled across the pavement before growing into the familiar, rising whine of compressed air. Marcus instinctively checked his watch. Daniel noticed. "You are timing the engine spool." Marcus nodded. "I need to know if the vibration appears where I expected." The second engine came alive, its sound blending with the first, until the entire airport seemed to vibrate beneath their feet. Employees gathered near service vehicles to watch the Billionaire's departure. Some waved toward the cockpit. Others returned to work without another thought. Marcus could not look away. His eyes stayed fixed on the left engine as the aircraft slowly began taxiing toward runway 18 center. Daniel rested a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Maybe you are wrong," he said quietly, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. Marcus continued watching the airplane roll farther down the taxiway. "I have never wanted to be wrong more than I do today." The Gulfstream rolled steadily toward the runway, its polished wings reflecting the late morning sunlight as though nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Inside the spacious cabin, Richard Hawthorne loosened his tie and accepted a fresh cup of coffee from the flight attendant. Across from him sat Chief Financial Officer Elaine Foster, reviewing a stack of acquisition documents on her tablet. "We still make the 11:30 meeting in Manhattan?" she asked. Richard glanced at his watch and nodded confidently. "With time to spare. Nothing delays this trip." In the cockpit, Captain Andrew Collins completed the final checklist beside First Officer Kevin Morales. Every instrument appeared normal. Fuel levels matched the flight plan. Weather conditions were nearly perfect. The engines responded smoothly through each stage of the pre-flight procedure. "Charlotte ground, Hawthorne 7 requesting taxi clearance." The response came almost immediately. "Hawthorne 7, taxi to runway 18 center via Alpha and Bravo. Taxi 18 center via Alpha and Bravo, Hawthorne 7." The aircraft continued forward with calm precision, while hundreds of yards away Marcus Bennett remained standing beside the perimeter fence, his eyes never leaving the left engine. Daniel Brooks watched him instead of the airplane. "You are still thinking about that compressor fracture," Marcus answered without looking away. The readings were too consistent. Metal fatigue rarely announces itself twice. Daniel folded his arms tightly. "The onboard monitoring system has not triggered any warning." Marcus nodded slowly. "Not yet. Some failures happen before the computers have enough time to recognize the pattern." A maintenance truck passed behind them, its driver slowing just enough to wave at Daniel before continuing toward another hangar. Life around the airport continued with ordinary rhythm. Luggage carts moved between terminals. Regional jets lined up for departure. Families watched airplanes through observation windows without realizing that one conversation earlier that morning might soon change dozens of lives forever. Back inside the Gulfstream, Elaine looked toward Richard with a faint smile. That young mechanic certainly had confidence. Richard gave a dismissive shrug. "Confidence is cheap. Experience is expensive." Another executive chuckled politely. He probably wanted attention. Richard looked out the cabin window as the airplane approached the hold-short line. "The problem with young people is that they mistake intelligence for judgment." His words settled across the cabin without challenge. No one wanted to disagree with the man signing their paychecks. In the cockpit, Captain Collins advanced the throttles slightly during the final engine response check. The turbine whine deepened into a smooth, powerful hum. Kevin studied the engine display for another moment. Everything looked stable. Collins nodded. "Beautiful airplane." Neither pilot knew that the microscopic fracture hidden deep within the compressor assembly remained invisible to every sensor they trusted. Marcus suddenly shifted his weight, his eyes narrow. "Did you hear that?" Daniel listened carefully. At first, everything sounded ordinary. Then Marcus spoke again. There is a slight oscillation underneath the normal compressor tone. Daniel strained to hear through the distance separating them from the taxiway. That could be wind. Marcus shook his head almost immediately. "No. It repeats every rotation cycle." Daniel remained silent. Years of experience had taught him never to ignore instinct, especially when it came from someone who understood machines the way Marcus did. The older engineer reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over Richard Hawthorne's number for several seconds before stopping. He knew exactly what would happen if he called. Richard would hang up before he finished the first sentence. Nearby, one of the airport operations supervisors noticed Marcus staring so intensely at the departing aircraft. "You all right, son?" Marcus answered honestly. "I hope I am completely wrong." The supervisor looked toward the runway. "Looks like another perfect departure to me." Marcus whispered almost to himself, "I hope it stays that way." Air traffic control cleared the aircraft for takeoff. Hawthorne 7, runway 18 center cleared for departure. Cleared for takeoff. Hawthorne 7. Captain Collins smoothly advanced both throttles toward full takeoff power. The engines answered with a deep, rising roar that rolled across the airport like distant thunder. The aircraft accelerated rapidly down the center line as sunlight shimmered across its silver fuselage. Employees paused to watch another successful departure from one of the busiest private terminals in North Carolina. Daniel quietly lowered his phone without making the call. Marcus never blinked. His breathing slowed. Every lesson his father had ever taught him echoed through his mind at once. Listen to the machine. Respect the truth. Never argue with physics. Then, just as the aircraft reached rotation speed, something changed in the sound of the left engine, so subtle that almost no one else noticed it. The sound changed so quickly that most people never noticed it. To everyone standing near the terminal, it remained the familiar roar of two powerful jet engines lifting another private aircraft into a clear Carolina sky. To Marcus Bennett, it sounded like a warning becoming reality. The steady rhythm he had listened to only seconds earlier developed a faint metallic flutter hidden beneath the normal turbine pitch. His shoulders stiffened. "Daniel," he said without taking his eyes off the aircraft, "it is happening." Daniel Brooks listened carefully. At first he heard nothing unusual. Then, almost buried beneath the engine noise, came a brief vibration that seemed slightly out of sync with the smooth acceleration of the aircraft. His face lost its color. "Dear God," he whispered. The Gulfstream continued racing down runway 18 center, gathering speed with every passing second. Inside the cockpit, Captain Andrew Collins kept his hands steady on the controls while scanning the instrument panel. Airspeed increased exactly as expected. Engine pressure remained inside operational limits. Fuel flow looked balanced, yet something felt different. A barely noticeable vibration traveled through the rudder pedals beneath his feet. "Do you feel that?" he asked First Officer Kevin Morales. Kevin rested one hand against the center console. "Very slight. Could be runway texture." Captain Collins nodded but continued monitoring the engine displays more closely. Nothing on the digital screen suggested immediate danger. Every computer on board insisted both engines were operating normally. Behind the cockpit door, Richard Hawthorne looked up from the acquisition contract after feeling the same faint tremor beneath his seat. "Little rough today," he remarked casually. Elaine Foster looked toward the window. "Probably just the runway." Richard smiled confidently. "This airplane has crossed the Atlantic without a problem. One little vibration does not worry me." Across the cabin, another executive laughed softly. "Good thing we did not delay the flight because of an intern." Several passengers nodded in agreement before returning to their laptops and documents. No one realized those words would soon weigh heavily on every memory of that morning. Outside, Marcus instinctively stepped closer to the fence as the aircraft accelerated beyond 100 miles per hour. Every instinct told him the fracture inside the compressor assembly was expanding under increasing pressure. Metal under stress never failed politely. It always reached a point where tiny weaknesses became impossible to contain. Daniel pulled out his phone again and dialed the airport operations center instead of Richard Hawthorne. The line connected immediately. "Operations," a dispatcher answered. Daniel spoke quickly. "This is Senior Engineer Daniel Brooks at Hawthorne Aviation Services. I need someone to contact the control tower immediately. There may be an engine issue with Hawthorne 7. The dispatcher hesitated. "Do you have confirmation?" Daniel looked toward the aircraft, now approaching rotation speed. His voice tightened. "No confirmation. Only serious concern." The dispatcher answered carefully. "Without an active emergency declaration from the crew, there is very little we can do." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. "I understand." The call ended. Marcus remained perfectly still. "It is too late now," he said quietly. The Gulfstream lifted gracefully from the runway, its landing gear beginning to retract as it climbed into the bright blue sky above Charlotte. For one brief moment, relief spread across the faces of employees watching from the terminal windows. Maybe the young intern had simply been mistaken. Maybe the expensive diagnostics had been more reliable than human instinct. Daniel wanted to believe exactly that. He released a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. "Perhaps it stabilized," he said hopefully. Marcus never answered. His eyes stayed fixed on the left side of the climbing aircraft. The subtle vibration he had heard was now gone. That silence frightened him even more. "The sound disappeared," he whispered. Daniel frowned. "Is that good?" Marcus slowly shook his head. "No. Sometimes the worst failures become quiet just before everything changes." High above the runway, Captain Collins adjusted the climb angle while reviewing departure instructions from air traffic control. "Charlotte departure, Hawthorne 7 passing 2,500 feet. The controller responded calmly with new heading instructions. Everything sounded routine over the radio. Kevin glanced once more at the engine display. Temperatures are climbing slightly on the left side. Collins looked over immediately. The increase was small, almost insignificant, but unexpected. "Monitor it," he said. Kevin nodded. "Already watching." Inside the passenger cabin, Richard finally signed the first page of the acquisition agreement. "By this afternoon," he said with quiet satisfaction, "this company becomes ours." At that exact moment, a bright caution light illuminated on the cockpit display, followed almost instantly by a warning tone that cut through the calm silence like a single unanswered question. The warning tone echoed through the cockpit with calm precision, but its meaning instantly changed the atmosphere inside the aircraft. Captain Andrew Collins looked at the engine display as an amber caution message appeared across the primary monitor. "Left engine vibration high." The numbers were still inside certified operating limits, yet they were climbing far faster than they should have. Kevin Morales immediately opened the engine status page. "Captain, vibration is increasing." Collins kept one hand firmly on the controls while scanning every instrument. "Reduce climb power slightly." Kevin adjusted the throttle with measured movements. Both pilots watched the display, hoping the readings would stabilize. Instead, another alert appeared. "Left engine temperature rising." Collins pressed the radio switch. "Charlotte departure, Hawthorne 7 requesting immediate vectors back to the airport. We have an engine indication we would like to evaluate." The controller answered without hesitation. "Hawthorne 7, turn left heading 090. You are cleared, direct back to Charlotte." Advise if you require emergency assistance. Collins exchanged a brief glance with Kevin before replying. Stand by. In the passenger cabin, the subtle banking motion interrupted Richard Hawthorne's conversation. He looked toward the cockpit door as Elaine Foster lowered her tablet. "Why are we turning already?" she asked. A flight attendant maintained a professional smile as she stepped into the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has requested that everyone remain seated while we return to Charlotte as a precaution." Richard frowned. "A precaution?" The flight attendant nodded politely. "That is all the information I have at the moment, sir." Richard leaned back with visible irritation. "Unbelievable. We lose an hour because somebody wants to double-check a gauge." Across the cabin, another executive tried to sound optimistic. "Probably a sensor malfunction," Richard answered confidently. "Exactly. Modern aircraft are filled with false warnings." Meanwhile, nearly 3 miles away, Marcus Bennett remained beside the airport fence with Daniel Brooks. Neither man spoke as they watched the aircraft begin its wide turn back toward Charlotte. Daniel noticed the change first. "They are returning." Marcus nodded slowly. "The cockpit finally sees something." Daniel looked at him with disbelief. "You called it before every onboard computer." Marcus did not look proud. His face carried only quiet concern. "I wish I had been wrong." Daniel's phone rang. It was the airport operations dispatcher. "Daniel, the aircraft requested priority handling. They have an engine indication but have not declared an emergency." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Thank you." When the call ended, he whispered, "At least they have time." Marcus stared at the distant aircraft crossing beneath scattered white clouds. "Only if the damage stays contained." Back in the cockpit, Kevin carefully reviewed every engine parameter again. "Captain, vibration continues increasing even with reduced power." Collins nodded once. "Prepare the engine failure checklist in case we need it." Neither pilot panicked. Years of training had taught them that discipline solved more problems than fear ever could. Every movement remained deliberate. Every checklist was read aloud. Every response was confirmed twice. Yet despite their calm professionalism, the warning messages continued, multiplying one after another. The left engine oil pressure began fluctuating. Exhaust gas temperature climbed another few degrees. Kevin looked at Collins. "This pattern does not make sense." Collins answered quietly. "It does if there is internal mechanical damage." Those words hung inside the cockpit for several long seconds. In the cabin, passengers had become noticeably quieter. Laptops closed. Conversations faded. Several people looked through the windows toward the engine, searching for something they could not fully understand. Elaine finally turned toward Richard. "Do you remember what the young engineer actually said?" Richard sighed impatiently. "He claimed there was a structural defect." Elaine hesitated before asking another question. "Did anyone inspect it after he left?" Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the floor as though replaying the events inside the hangar. Security escorting Marcus away. Employees standing silently. The inspection ending before anyone verified the claim. For the first time that morning, confidence gave way to uncertainty. His voice became noticeably quieter. "No." At almost the same moment, Kevin suddenly pointed at the engine display. "Captain." Vibration just spiked. Collins tightened his grip on the controls as another warning tone filled the cockpit, louder and more urgent than before. The master caution light flashed across the instrument panel, and this time neither pilot needed the computer to tell them that the situation had changed completely. The cockpit filled with disciplined voices instead of panic. Captain Andrew Collins kept his eyes on the horizon, while Kevin Morales reached for the emergency checklist with steady hands. "Left engine vibration is now beyond operational limits," Kevin reported. Another warning tone sounded, followed by a flashing advisory that neither pilot had expected to see during a routine business flight. Collins responded immediately. "Maintain control first. Everything else comes second." Kevin nodded. "Agreed." He began reading each checklist item aloud, careful not to skip a single line. "Engine instruments cross-checked." Collins answered. "Confirmed." "Fuel balance." "Confirmed." "Prepare for possible engine shutdown if required." "Standing by." Every movement inside the cockpit reflected years of training, but both men understood that no checklist could repair damaged metal spinning thousands of times each minute. Charlotte Departure noticed the extended silence before calling again. "Hawthorne 7, confirm your status." Collins pressed the transmit switch. "Charlotte Departure, Hawthorne 7 has an abnormal engine condition. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate priority landing." The controller's calm voice answered without hesitation. "Hawthorne 7, Emergency acknowledged. Runway 18 center is available. All traffic is being cleared. Emergency crews are moving into position. On the ground, airport, fire, and rescue vehicles rolled toward their designated staging areas, with lights flashing but without unnecessary urgency. Controllers redirected arriving aircraft. Ground crews paused their work and looked toward the sky. Inside the passenger cabin, the atmosphere changed the moment the flight attendant quietly secured every loose item before taking her assigned jump seat. Passengers recognized that routine procedures had given way to emergency procedures. Richard Hawthorne watched her expression carefully. "What is happening?" he asked. She answered with measured honesty. "The captain is bringing us back to Charlotte as safely and quickly as possible, sir." Richard looked toward Elaine Foster, who was already gripping the armrest. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The confidence that had filled the cabin earlier that morning had quietly disappeared. Richard's mind returned again and again to Marcus Bennett, standing in the hangar holding a diagnostic tablet with both hands. He remembered the young engineer's exact words. The fracture could expand under maximum power. At the time, those words had sounded like unnecessary fear. Now they echoed inside his memory with painful clarity. He lowered his eyes and whispered almost to himself. "He was trying to help us." Elaine looked at him. "Richard." He did not answer. Outside, Marcus and Daniel Brooks remained standing beside the perimeter fence, watching the aircraft descend into a wide pattern for its return. The airplane was still several miles away, small against the bright afternoon sky, yet Marcus noticed something that no one else around him seemed to recognize. The climb had ended sooner than expected. The aircraft looked heavier now, slower, as though every mile demanded careful negotiation instead of effortless flight. Daniel followed Marcus's gaze. "They are holding altitude." Marcus nodded once. "The crew is protecting the airplane." Daniel folded his arms tightly. "Those pilots know exactly what they are doing," Marcus answered quietly. "I know they do." A gentle breeze moved across the grass between the runway and the fence, carrying only the distant sound of turbines and emergency sirens preparing below. For a brief moment, everything felt strangely peaceful. The sky remained brilliantly blue. The sunlight reflected from the aircraft's wings. Even the birds circling beyond the airport continued their lazy afternoon flight. Marcus thought about his father's words again. Machines always tell the truth. People decide whether to listen. Back in the cockpit, Kevin looked at the latest engine data and felt his heartbeat slow rather than race. Calm thinking mattered now more than ever. "Captain," he said carefully, "the vibration has stabilized for the moment, but the temperature is still climbing." Collins nodded. "We keep the power exactly where it is. No sudden changes." Kevin acknowledged the instruction. For several long seconds, the warning tones stopped. The cockpit became almost quiet except for the steady hum of the remaining systems and the voices from air traffic control guiding them home. Collins finally allowed himself one careful breath. "We are going to get everyone back on the ground." Before Kevin could answer, a deep shudder traveled through the airframe, stronger than anything they had felt before. Every instrument on the left side of the engine display flickered at once, and a new caution illuminated across the panel as both pilots instinctively looked toward the same screen. The shudder lasted less than a second, yet everyone on board felt it. Coffee rippled inside untouched cups. Pens rolled across polished tables. Overhead cabin lights flickered once before returning to normal. Captain Andrew Collins tightened his grip on the control yoke, while Kevin Morales focused on the engine display. The warning that now filled the center screen removed every remaining doubt. "Left engine failure imminent." Kevin looked toward Collins. "We have compressor instability." Collins answered without hesitation. "Execute the engine failure procedure." Kevin immediately reached for the checklist while Collins maintained absolute focus on flying the aircraft. "Throttle idle." Confirmed. "Fuel cutoff." Confirmed. "Engine isolation." Confirmed. Every command was spoken clearly. Every response remained calm. Training replaced emotion. Professionalism replaced fear. Yet before the final checklist item could be completed, a sharp mechanical report echoed through the airframe, followed by a powerful vibration that traveled from the left wing through the entire cabin. Several passengers gasped as the airplane leaned unexpectedly before Collins corrected the attitude with smooth control inputs. Richard Hawthorne instinctively reached for the armrest while Elaine Foster looked toward the window, her face turning pale. She could not see the damaged engine from her seat, but she no longer needed to. The silence inside the cabin had become heavier than any announcement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Collins speaking. We have experienced a mechanical malfunction involving one engine. The aircraft remains under control, and we are returning to Charlotte. Please remain seated with your seatbelt securely fastened. Our crew is fully trained for situations like this. His calm voice slowed racing hearts throughout the cabin. Flight attendants moved carefully through the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering reassuring smiles despite the uncertainty around them. Richard lowered his head for a brief moment. Every sentence Marcus Bennett had spoken inside the hangar replayed with painful clarity. Please, just one additional inspection. Richard closed his eyes. He had not ignored an opinion. He had ignored evidence. Thousands of feet below, Marcus stood beside Daniel Brooks without saying a word. Both men watched the aircraft descending toward the airport under controlled flight. Airport rescue vehicles had now reached their standby positions near the runway. Their flashing lights reflected across the pavement beneath the bright afternoon sun. Daniel finally broke the silence. They still have control. Marcus nodded. Captain Collins is protecting everyone on board. Daniel looked at the young engineer beside him. How did you know the crack would spread that way? Marcus answered quietly. Because the vibration frequency matched progressive compressor fatigue. Once the metal reached maximum stress during takeoff, every additional rotation increased the fracture until the blades could no longer remain perfectly balanced. Daniel stared at him with disbelief. You saw all of that from one inspection. Marcus slowly shook his head. I saw enough to know they deserved another inspection. Back inside the cockpit, the left engine had now been safely shut down. But new caution messages continued appearing as the damaged components cooled unevenly. Kevin monitored every system carefully. Hydraulic pressure remains stable. Collins nodded. Electrical systems normal, Kevin continued. Single engine performance is holding. Collins looked through the windshield where Charlotte Douglas International Airport appeared in the distance. The runway stretched ahead like a narrow ribbon beneath the afternoon sky. We are going to bring them home, he said quietly. Air traffic control cleared every other aircraft from the approach path. Hawthorne 7, the runway is yours. Wind calm. Emergency equipment is standing by. Thank you, Charlotte, Collins answered. We appreciate the assistance. In the passenger cabin, nobody opened a laptop anymore. Nobody spoke about billion-dollar acquisitions or business schedules. Every person simply watched the windows, listened to the steady voice from the cockpit, and hoped to see the runway growing closer. Richard finally looked toward Elaine. His voice had lost every trace of authority that morning had carried. If we land safely, I have something I need to do. Elaine understood immediately. Find Marcus. Richard nodded slowly. No. First, I need to apologize to him. Outside, Marcus watched the descending aircraft emerge from a thin layer of scattered clouds. For the first time since the airplane left the ground, he allowed himself to believe everyone might survive. Then, as the aircraft aligned with the runway and reduced power for final approach, a bright flash appeared near the damaged engine, followed by a cloud of dark smoke that spread behind the left wing, and every emergency vehicle immediately accelerated toward the runway before the aircraft had even touched the ground. The dark smoke trailing behind the left wing spread across the afternoon sky like ink carried by the wind. Yet Captain Andrew Collins never allowed his attention to drift from the runway growing larger through the windshield. Continue the approach, he said calmly. Kevin Morales answered without hesitation. Landing checklist complete. Emergency crews are in position. The aircraft descended with one operating engine, every control input measured and deliberate. Air traffic control remained calm. Hawthorne 7, wind is calm. You are cleared to land. All emergency vehicles are standing by. Collins acknowledged the transmission before gently guiding the airplane across the runway threshold. The remaining engine held steady. The landing gear touched the pavement with a firm but controlled impact, followed by the main wheels settling smoothly onto the centerline. Reverse thrust from the operating engine slowed the aircraft, while the braking system worked exactly as designed. The damaged engine remained silent except for the faint metallic sounds of cooling components hidden beneath its protective casing. Airport rescue vehicles followed alongside the runway, matching the aircraft's speed until it rolled safely to a complete stop. Inside the cabin, nobody spoke for several long seconds. The only sounds came from heavy breathing, the clicking of seatbelts, and the distant hum of emergency equipment surrounding the airplane. Richard Hawthorne remained seated with both hands resting on his knees. His billion-dollar negotiations no longer mattered. His schedule no longer mattered. The only thing echoing inside his mind was the quiet voice of a 19-year-old engineer asking for one more inspection. Captain Collins came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground. Please remain seated until emergency personnel complete their external inspection." Relief swept through the cabin like a silent wave. Several passengers closed their eyes. Others quietly thanked God. A flight attendant smiled for the first time since the warning began. Outside, firefighters carefully examined the left engine before giving the all-clear for passengers to disembark. Within minutes, representatives from airport operations, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board arrived at the scene. Captain Collins stepped down the aircraft stairs carrying the flight log beneath his arm. One investigator approached immediately. "Captain Collins, can you describe the sequence?" Collins answered without exaggeration. "We experienced progressive vibration, rising temperature, compressor instability, and indications consistent with internal mechanical failure. We returned as soon as the warnings became evident." The investigator wrote several notes before asking another question. "Had anyone reported concerns before departure?" Collins paused. "I heard there was a disagreement involving a young maintenance intern before boarding, but I do not know the details." Nearby, Daniel Brooks and Marcus Bennett stood behind the security perimeter, watching emergency teams surround the aircraft. Marcus showed no sign of satisfaction. Instead, he quietly lowered his eyes. "Everyone made it home," he whispered. Daniel nodded. "Because the crew stayed calm." Marcus agreed immediately. Captain Collins saved every person on board. A black government SUV pulled onto the service road as investigators began collecting maintenance records from Hawthorne Aviation Services. One technician carried a sealed case containing the aircraft's digital maintenance history. Another requested copies of inspection reports completed that morning. It did not take long before one investigator frowned while reviewing the documentation. "There is an incomplete inspection record here," she said. "Who started this report?" A supervisor looked through the electronic file before answering. "Marcus Bennett." "Engineering intern. Why was it never completed?" the investigator asked. The supervisor hesitated. He was dismissed before finishing the inspection. The investigator looked up immediately. "Dismissed by whom?" Nobody answered for several uncomfortable seconds. Richard Hawthorne slowly stepped forward. His face carried none of the confidence that had filled the hangar only hours earlier. "By me," he said quietly. Every nearby conversation stopped. The investigator studied him carefully. "Did Mr. Bennett identify a specific concern?" Richard swallowed before answering. "He warned me about a structural defect inside the left engine compressor. I believed he was mistaken. I did not authorize another inspection." The investigator closed the maintenance file without saying a word. Her silence carried more weight than criticism ever could. A few moments later, specialists removed the damaged engine cowling for a preliminary visual examination. One senior investigator leaned forward with a flashlight, studying the compressor section before calling another engineer closer. "There it is," he said quietly. Progressive metal fatigue originating exactly where the inspection notes indicated. Daniel looked toward Marcus, whose eyes remained fixed on the aircraft instead of the people now staring at him. He had not wanted recognition. He had wanted someone to listen before the airplane ever left the ground. The airport grew unusually quiet as the first official findings spread from one investigation team to another. No one raised their voice. No one argued with the evidence resting inside the damaged engine. The fractured compressor section matched Marcus Bennett's unfinished inspection notes almost perfectly, down to the exact stage where he had highlighted abnormal vibration patterns before being escorted out of the hangar. Veteran mechanics who had spent decades around turbine engines slowly removed their caps in silent respect. One of them looked toward Daniel Brooks and whispered, "That young man saw something most of us would have missed." Daniel answered softly, "He was never trying to prove he was smarter than anyone. He was only trying to protect people." A few minutes later, Richard Hawthorne walked across the service road alone. His expensive suit carried faint traces of dust from the emergency staging area, and for the first time in many years, there was no security team surrounding him, no executives waiting for instructions, and no reporters asking questions. There was only a billionaire walking toward the young engineer he had publicly dismissed less than 3 hours earlier. Marcus noticed him approaching but remained exactly where he was, standing beside the chain-link fence overlooking the quiet runway. Richard stopped a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The afternoon breeze moved gently across the grass while the cooling aircraft rested silently behind them. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Marcus." The young engineer looked at him respectfully. "Yes, sir." Richard lowered his eyes before continuing. I owe you an apology that should have happened before that airplane ever left the ground. Marcus listened without interruption. Richard took a slow breath. I judged your age before I listened to your knowledge. I judged your position before I examined your evidence. I allowed my pride to become more important than the truth. Marcus answered quietly. I never wanted to challenge your authority, sir. Richard nodded. I know that now. Another long silence followed before Richard spoke again. You tried to save every person on that airplane, including me. Marcus glanced toward the Gulf Stream surrounded by investigators. Captain Collins and his crew brought everyone home safely. They deserve the credit. Richard looked toward the aircraft as well. They saved our lives in the air. You gave them the chance to do it before we ever left the ground. Daniel Brooks watched the conversation from several yards away without saying a word. He understood that some moments did not belong to witnesses. They belonged only to truth. Later that afternoon, representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board completed their preliminary briefing. The lead investigator summarized the findings with careful professionalism. Current evidence indicates that the initial maintenance concern documented before departure accurately identified the location of the developing mechanical failure. Additional inspection at that time would likely have prevented today's emergency return. Cameras remained lowered. Nobody rushed to speak. Those simple words carried enough weight on their own. Richard turned toward the assembled employees of Hawthorne Aviation Services. Mechanics, cleaners, dispatchers, pilots, interns, and executives all stood together in the same hangar where Marcus had been dismissed only hours earlier. Richard faced them with unusual humility. This morning I taught every one of you the wrong lesson, he said. I showed you that rank mattered more than truth. From this day forward, that changes. He walked to Marcus and held out a company identification badge that had been reprinted less than an hour earlier. Marcus Bennett, I would like to offer you your position back. Marcus looked at the badge but did not immediately reach for it. Richard continued, not as an intern, as a junior engineering specialist. You earned that title through knowledge, integrity, and courage. Marcus accepted the badge with both hands. Thank you, sir. I accept because I still want to help make every flight safer. Richard smiled for the first time that day. It was not the confident smile of a billionaire closing another business deal. It was the grateful smile of a man who had learned that wisdom could arrive wearing a maintenance uniform instead of an expensive suit. As the sun slowly settled beyond the runways of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, golden light reflected across the quiet Gulf Stream, while airport crews prepared to tow it toward the investigation hangar. Marcus stood watching in silence beside Daniel Brooks. Neither man celebrated. Neither man spoke about victory. They simply watched the fading sunlight settle across the airfield, where one honest voice had nearly been ignored. The runway stretched into the distance, calm once again, and the evening breeze carried only the quiet reminder that real strength is not measured by wealth, age, or authority, but by the courage to speak the truth even when no one wants to hear it.